My presentation is about quality of life after TC treatment, and the main question when I look at this topic in the literature is we were just talking about evidence and then the evidence base for therapeutic communities, but this is a topic you seldom see that was studied in TC studies, which is quite strange because TCs are all about quality of life, and that will be the focus of my presentation. First of all, I would like to dedicate my presentation to Eric, our beloved and inspiring colleague, friend, and supervisor. And I found back a picture of him, I think a couple of years ago, when he met here for EWADOR conference in Dublin, and he visited. And I'm glad to announce that the Therapeutic Community Journal is just out, which includes, or which is a special issue dedicated to Eric and his work, with contributions from some of his close colleagues, and also, like a bit of a report of his life story and legacy. So I think those of you who are EFTC members will receive this issue automatically, and I think it's a nice tribute, a nice memory of Eric and what he has meant to us, but I think this has already been told many times during this conference. My presentation will first focus on quality of life and what it means, what are related concepts, how it has been studied in addiction treatment, and then specifically in TCs for addictions. It's not usual to come up with a conclusion in one of your first slides, but one of my questions, and I would like to receive your input and feedback around that, but why hasn't quality of life been studied in TCs, or so little? And then that leads me to the recommendation that we need to study it more. Good. Quality of life, the concept, its operationalization. When I would ask each of you what means quality of life to you, which I won't do, it will probably come up with different answers. Someone saying health, other maybe saying rest, being able to decide whatever I want to do, a beer, I don't know what would come up. But it's a term that everybody understands, but it's very hard to define. And that's also a problem, of course, when you want to study it. But what we see is that the last decade, there is increased attention for quality of life. And that has, of course, to do with increased life expectancy and also the recognition of various disorders as being chronic, including addiction, on which I come back. There's also, of course, consequences of that conceptualization, meaning that we need to move from acute care to more continuing support, especially for people with long-lasting support needs. And also the medical approach has been replaced by a more biomedical, social, psychological model, and also an individual support model. And it has been influenced by deinstitutionalization, which was replaced by more community-based services, consumer empowerment, person-centered planning, and all these type of things related to it. When we look at a commonly accepted definition, I think there is lacking an I, the definition of the WHO of quality of life is it's quite general, but at the same time it points at some of the core elements. So it's an individual's perception, so subjective element is very important, of their position in life in the context of the culture and value systems in which they live and in relation to their goals, expectations, standards, and concerns. So it's not only about something which is measurable in an objective way, but it's also, or it's primarily about the subjective way it is perceived. It's a broad-ranging, comprehensive concept which is affected in a complex way by person's physical health, their psychological state, the level of autonomy, level of independence, social interactions, social relations, personal beliefs, and environmental aspects. So the main characteristics are it's a subjective concept, it's multidimensional, often it is reduced to physical health or psychological health, which is absolutely not the case, because social connectedness, social belonging, self-determination are very important aspects of quality of life. It is not a static concept, it's dynamic, it changes over time, and it's universal, which is important because it has been studied in different contexts across different cultures, and it leads to the same conceptualizations also of quality of life. And, which is very important, it is not looking at like the absence of illness, the absence of symptoms, but it's something positive, it's about strengths, it's about capabilities. So some of the problems with the concept of quality of life is that the focus has, as I told, been primarily on health, and it has often been defined by others, so by professionals, by people in the direct environment of people, by parents, by whoever lives together with people. So what is also very important is that if we want to measure it, there's a strong impact of goals, expectations, and abilities on the way they can be fulfilled. So it's like a circular concept, which is, and makes it also hard to measure. Many studies in the field of addiction treatment, but in general, have focused on health-related quality of life, which is different and which should be distinguished from quality of life. Because health-related quality of life, it's more about an indication of what are the effects of a disease on a person, on his general functioning. Can he still climb the stairs? Can he function normally in daily life? So, especially related to physical and mental health issues. And the focus is on pathology, on deficits, so not much on strengths or capabilities, which is the case with quality of life. So therefore, I would like to propose to look at quality of life instead of the more narrow-focused health-related quality of life approach. Quality of life has a positive connotation. It looks at overall well-being and satisfaction with life, and it's merely about what is a good quality of life rather than, as I told, the absence of pathology. If we look at instruments that have measured quality of life, then we often see SF36 or SF12 or other WHO qual, which is, I think, more comprehensive, but still has a primarily attention for these health-related issues, which is, maybe too narrow. Also, related concepts have come up, and I would like to mention that quality of life can be regarded as like the more encompassing concept, which includes other concepts like well-being, because material well-being, psychological well-being are elements, constituting elements of quality of life, but at the same time, quality of life is a broader concept. Happiness refers to a like emotional, psychological state, and both concepts, well-being and happiness, are like the subjective perspective on quality of life, while quality of life has also some objective indicators, like having an employment, having like daily activities, and so on. So in that sense, these concepts should be distinguished. And when we look at well-being in the literature, then we have two better dominant approaches, which is like a primarily hedonistic approach, which sees well-being as striving for ultimate pleasure, for happiness, including pleasures of body and mind. And the aim is to maximize like pleasure and happiness and satisfaction. While the eudaimonic approach of well-being is a more philosophical approach, going back to the old Greek philosopher Aristotle, and who stated that happiness could not be equated with pleasure. It's much more. It's about giving purpose to your life. It's about giving meaning to one's life. So doing what is worth doing, and developing and realizing one's personal potential and life goals, and moving towards self-actualization are central aspects of the eudaimonic approach. So subjective well-being, which is then the operationalization of well-being, is commonly used in the literature and starts usually from a hedonic approach in which the person is given the freedom to define happiness based on his own frame of reference. While it also includes, besides an affective component, a cognitive component. And on the other hand, eudaimonic well-being represents a statement of well-being resulting in personal growth, engagement, and also realizing what one thinks is meaningful in life. Quality of life is also related with recovery, of which we have heard quite a lot about. And I think it's also important to disentangle both concepts, because recovery is like probably a broader concept, which is about personal recovery, which is about achieving also the things that things are important in life. And quality of life will rather be an indicator of recovery, of personal recovery, but it's more, or better, recovery is broader than just quality of life. Especially because recovery is often conceptualized as just clinical recovery, which means like recovering from like the main symptoms one have, like an addiction problem. So abstinence, absence of symptoms are then, in that perspective of clinical recovery, are signs that one is recovered. While personal recovery is much broader, and one of the very first definitions, which is often used of personal recovery, is Anthony's definition, who is like a system survivor himself, and who described it as a deeply personal and unique process of changing one's attitudes, values, goals, roles. It's a way of living a satisfying, hopeful, and contributing life, even with the limitation caused by addiction. Recovery involves the development of a new meaning and purpose in life as one grows beyond the catastrophic effects of addiction or mental illness, in this case. Quality of life in addiction treatment. I looked into the literature, and when you look at quality of life and addiction or dependence, then you often are confronted with studies which have been performed in opiate-dependent individuals, mainly in the context of substitution treatment, of methadone maintenance treatment. And the problem with treatment evaluation in addiction treatment and also in TC treatment is that it often had like a very unilateral focus on socially desirable outcomes, like people should prove that they don't use drugs anymore, that they are no longer involved in criminal activities, no rearrests, and that they have a job. It's often problem-oriented, and there is limited attention in treatment evaluation in general for individuals' subjective appraisal and their perspectives, which is, of course, due to the lack that the concept of quality of life has not been really found implementation into this field. Oops. Okay. So what do we know about quality of life in substance abusing populations? Well, we do know that quality of life, at least when people enter treatment, that their quality of life is much lower when you compare it to the general population. And it's probably most comparable with the quality of life of people with mental health problems. I will show you some slides which go back to a study that we have done at our department a couple of years ago with the very first cohort of individuals who started methadone treatment in Ghent, which was about in the years 97 to 2002. and where we looked at the quality of life of these individuals 5 to 10 years after these people started treatment. And then we see that some of the bars are quite high. Indicated in blue means that they are experiencing a high quality of life on that domain, and when the blue bar is very low, then it means they are experiencing a low quality of life. So what you see is that, for instance, the domains framework, positive self-esteem, and safety are very high, indicating that people have goals in life, that they are experiencing autonomy, positive self-esteem, and that they're feeling safe in the environment where they live. But on the other hand, if you look, for instance, at finances, if you look at family relations, and also the fulfillment of the goals they have, then they score low. And this is, we have to keep in mind that it's about an opiate substitution treatment population. But there is quite some discrepancies between different domains of quality of life, which is important, because if you look at quality of life as by measuring just one item, or just looking at some domains like health, then you miss some of the others which are important. Good. We did some regression analysis on these data, and what came out as the main predictors of a good quality of life was like having some good and close friends and having structured daily activities. And two, I think, very important predictors of experiencing a good life, but predictors or negative predictors of quality of life were psychological distress and being treated with medication for psychological complaints, and also the feeling of not having the autonomy, not having the possibility to change one's living situation. So although this study has been performed on a different population, I think there is some of these data that we can take with us. Oops. It's almost the end of the conference. I think the batteries are quite low by now. Another slide that I want to share with you from this study is an analysis of the quality of life outcomes we did, and we looked at it through latent class analysis, which allowed us to cluster like 3 different groups of people. So we had the sample who went through substitution treatment, and then we could distinguish between not only between people having the green line experiencing a higher quality of life and those with a low quality of life, the one with the blue or the blue line, but also like an intermediate group or a pattern, a cluster of patterns of quality of life, which include like overall, so 4 on this scale we used, it was the Lancashire quality of life profile we used, and therefore is seen as like the threshold for experiencing a good quality of life. Then you see that the middle group, although they did not very well regarding their family relations, they had overall poor quality of life also regarding their financial situation, their health, but they were doing well regarding safety and how they were organized in life, and also regarding their living situation. So quality of life is important to measure it as a comprehensive, as a multidimensional concept. Okay. We did also qualitative interviews with these people, and we asked for what is a good quality of life for you, and then these 5 topics came up. So having social relationships and sense of belonging is very good for very important for experiencing quality of life. Psychological well-being, having emotional stability, having something to do, having an occupation instead of using drugs, feeling and being independent, being able to make choices, to make decisions, and having a meaningful life, having perspectives in life. These are two quotes, but I think they speak for itself, especially illustrating that quality of life is mainly something personal, something subjective, which differs from person to person. So there is a lot of instruments actually used to measure quality of life. And some of the most common instruments have been listed in two of the reviews I have been involved in recently. But it makes clear that there is around 15 to 20 instruments commonly used to measure quality of life in these opiate-dependent populations. And there is at least 80 to 90 articles which report on quality of life outcomes in opiate substitution treatment. I will show on some of the next slides that this number in TCs, and mainly the peer-reviewed literature, but also if you look beyond it into grey literature, you won't find more than 10, 15, which is just a fraction of what is available about this opiate-dependent population in substitution treatment. So the two most frequently used instruments to measure quality of life are the WHO QOL-BREF, so it's an abbreviated version of the WHO QOL questionnaire of quality of life, and the Lancashire Quality of Life Profile, which also includes the MANSA, which is like also a shorter version of about 20 items measuring subjective quality of life. All the others, so the number between brackets refers to the number of studies we found that used this instrument. I will skip this one because it's not clear. Quality of life in TCs. I just told you about the study of Jessica de Meyer on opiate substitution treated persons in Ghent and the quality of life, which was a study Eric supervised, and I can tell you this little anecdote because he liked the study and he liked very much the concept of quality of life being applied in addicted population. But he was also a bit uncomfortable with the fact that we found this, or we had these nice results from a study in primarily methadone-maintained persons, while we had no data about TCs. And he was convinced that, of course, TCs generate quality of life. So then started his pursuit of publishing an article on the fact that TCs, they increase and they strive for and they realize improved quality of life. This study has been recently published, posthumous, of Eric's presentation, which I think he brought 2 years ago, or maybe even 3 or 4 years ago, on quality of life in TCs, which is primarily a philosophical and ethical approach of this topic. But I think it's a nice, it's a nice remembrance and a nice paper. So it has not been a focus, quality of life in TCs. Despite numerous TC studies, very few have focused on quality of life or well-being. Primarily they focus on hard or socially desirable outcomes, and quality of life has if it has been measured, it was sometimes with just one item, which is of course not precise or not as precise as I just showed on some of the data I presented. I made a scoping review of longitudinal studies of TC treatment and quality of life and found less than 15 studies which were very heterogeneous, so very diverse. And in many of these studies, or at least in half of the studies I found, mental health outcomes were not reported, which is quite strange, and which is of course also linked to quality of life. It's very hard to see this table, I assume, but it's mainly about this column with the pluses and the minuses. Then you see there is a lot in the column with substance use outcomes and criminal activity outcomes, but there is much less in the column with health outcomes, which is suggesting these are 16 studies we included in our 2013 review of therapeutic communities, and only half of them, or just a little bit more reported mental health outcomes and non-reported quality of life as an outcome. The studies I found, I told you, diverse, but also sometimes of a bit strange background. So this is a study in Iran on therapeutic communities where they measured quality of life 3 weeks after people entered treatment, and the data are indicating that quality of life improves during the initial phase of treatment, especially health and psychological health in particular. Also, it seems from the same authors that when you compare TC treatment with methadone maintenance and other types of residential rehabilitation, very small sample in some of the subgroups, but that the therapeutic community group, improved significantly more than the other two groups on quality of life, but also on mental health outcomes. But so there is some warranty needed regarding these outcomes. I think the one study that has reported most extensively on quality of life outcomes after TC treatment is a study we found of Kuhlmine House, and I thought my colleague would present some of it, but I'm not bringing something new, but I think these outcomes clearly illustrate two things. Like the first figure is, the first column is indicating the residential TC, the second one the women TC, and then the third column is, I think, the day treatment center. So it indicates that quality of life is much lower upon entry for TC residents, and that women generally have lower quality of life upon entering treatment. But when you look at the second figure, then you see how it evolves throughout treatment. And then you see that in the initial 6 months of TC treatment, like the quality of life improves significantly among both groups, and then it tends to stabilize at a certain level and decreases a bit, which is not so strange, because there is something called the homeostasis theory by Cummins, which says that people will always look like to stabilize their quality of life. So it levels off, and it continues to be more or less at the same level over the 24-month period, equally for men and for women. Good. I found some nice quotes in that report too, and I think it also illustrates the importance of quality of life research in TCs. Post-treatment improvements in quality of life were reported by all participants. Establishing a routine, maintaining a household, moving away from full-time recovery-focused activities, reconnecting with the society, were cited as sources of fulfillment, joy, and self-esteem. Overall, participants aspired towards what they described as ordinary, everyday things. So the importance of having some structured activities, having some things to do in life, giving sense, giving meaning to one's life. I just included some other slides, but these are generally studies in TCs which have looked at quality of life, but if you look at them in detail, they're not really reporting on quality of life, but they just compared two groups in TCs, not really giving much information about quality of life after TC treatment. So that brings me to the main question: why has quality of life been studied so little in TCs? Well, I only have hypotheses about it, but it's a relatively new concept. Many of the big classical longitudinal studies have been performed before 2005, meaning that concept wasn't, quality of life was not so popular at that time. Often other indicators are used like as a proxy for quality of life, like well-being, like mental health, although well-being has not been studied much either in TCs. Mental ill health, when it has been measured, has then often been limited to one dimension, for instance, anxiety, depression. So it has been studied, but not so well reported, or and the findings that are available suggest that TC rehabilitation is efficacious in that it reduces levels of negative psychological states. But there is very studies replicating these findings. So often this has only been found for depression in one study or for anxiety in another study, but not been replicated in many other studies. And I think a major problem is that there is the implicit assumption that TCs promote and increase quality of life, but it has seldom been measured. It's taken for granted, it's seen as self-evidence, and there is considerable literature indicating that social connectedness, belonging, which is of course also about engaging in a TC and engaging in group treatment, it improves well-being. So indirectly we have a lot of evidence about quality of life after TC treatment, but we have very few data, except the Kuhlmann data I showed you, to prove this. So for instance, Clack and colleagues have tested the self-determination theory, which is about motivation. It's a motivational theory. And they have seen that higher levels of autonomy led to better psychological well-being, and people feel better during early stages of treatment, and also have higher commitment, higher engagement in treatment. So belonging and social connectedness are closely related to well-being, and also in recovery literature, it is shown that social networks and the number of social networks are critical for recovery and sustained remission. And belonging to a network of peers, of people in recovery, is one of the best predictors of a positive quality of life. In that sense, there is a recent study in Australia done by David Best and colleagues, the SONAR study, which has evaluated also quality of life after TC treatment, but unfortunately data are not yet published, but in the process of being published. Good. So it's definitely necessary to study quality of life more in TCs, which can also increase the evidence, and the evidence we can the evidence we can provide to policymakers. So I would suggest that we use quality of life as a routine outcome measure in TCs, because there are several instruments which are very brief, very short, very easy to administer, which can give an indication of quality of life. So the measures available are mentioned there, and it's probably a better indicator of what we do in TCs and what the outcomes are of TCs research than, for instance, just looking at substance use measured as a dichotomous term, being not using drugs or still using drugs. It can be used in and after treatment as an indicator of the treatment process, and it will also inform us about whether to adjust, whether to individualize certain program aspects at some points. I refer to a study we are setting up right now in the KIEM, where we aim to implement like a routine outcome measurement, where we use the MANSA, which is one of the quality of life and comprehensive quality of life measurements. And we will do that at baseline after 3, 6, 12 and 24 months. It's just a very short measurement, short assessment, 5 to 10 minutes, measured on a 7-point Likert scale, and including objective as well as subjective indicators. So this is the MANSA, or what it measures. And I finally refer to a study we are setting up right now in 4 countries, England, Scotland, Belgium and the Netherlands, where we will study life in recovery and pathways to recovery among 5 different groups, 5 different treatment mechanisms, one of it being natural recovery, people who recover without any formal help, which is which exists, but which is probably hard to detect. 12-step programs, other types of peer support, and then outpatient treatment and residential treatment persons who are in recovery. This study is running from now on until 2020. David Best is the principal investigator, and we hope in the near future to be able to present some of the results of this study, where quality of life is also measured in this group of recovering people. So to conclude, quality of life is much more than just looking at absence of symptoms or health-related problems. Given the need for continuing support also after TC treatment, what we heard yesterday in George's presentation, so we also need to assess quality of life or other indicators throughout TC treatment and beyond. Urgent need to include quality of life as an outcome measure in TC studies, and as so many good instruments are available in several languages, I think we should use these much more. I would like to thank you for your attention.